Thank you.
Okay, hope all of you've been well. And today I thought we could discuss a bit of what is known as the revival of dance, right? What we see in revival, the term revival, it's not essentially limited to Bharatanatyam alone. Carnatic music went through its own revival. Hindustani music went through revival. A lot of revival does not essentially mean an art form was revived, but it also means an art form was systemized. The art forms were given structure and made relevant for the times in which it was revived for, right? So, in that sense, I think even today, or like there is revival happening with dance every day, right? Uh, so but so revival is because very often in the Indian art scene we exclusively use the word revival only for Bharatanatyam, right? But music has had its own revival which is not often spoken about. I don't know if the Carnatic music circles actually speaks a lot about this. I am not sure, but there are other forms also that went through a revival, and that's very important for us to remember, right? There is this work that I'm borrowing from to talk about today, and it's called Rewriting the Script of Indian Dance. It's by Professor Matthew Allen. He's a scholar of Indian music, so he came to India to study music, and he was particularly interested in padams as in Sringara padams, and then that set him on a journey to understand the history of padams and history of dance, and he became one of the most important scholars of Indian dance. He's an American. He sits in Boston. Allen, yeah, Matthew Allen, and the work is called Rewriting the Script of Indian Dance. All right, most of what I'm talking about is from his work, but also probably with a little bit of an understanding of Indian dance, right? So I like his work because it sort of breaks down what revival is. So he says, in his own words, he says revival is a very complex process. And the word revival itself is a linguistic reduction. You're simplifying a lot of processes that have happened under one term, right? So what are these processes? One is, he says, revivification, that is bringing back to life, bringing dance back to life. Repopulation, because a new community has taken up dancing now. A reconstruction, because dance was sort of reformulated for the 20th century. Renaming, because Indian dance, not just Bharatanatyam, all dance forms in India took a new form and hence a new name, right? Resituation, because the spaces in which dance was performed changed. Lastly, restoration, restoration as in restoring the sacredness of the form. All right. So this is so you can understand that there were multiple re's involved in the entire revival process, and we'll go through each of this as and when we have to. I'm just repeating myself: revivification, repopulation, reconstruction, renaming, right? Resituation and restoration, right? We'll go through each of these. And the characters central to this process is the revival process is Rukmini Devi Arundel, E. Krishna Iyer, Dr. V. Raghavan. These are three central figures to the revival. Okay. Those who don't know these names, you must definitely write it down, although I don't insist on taking notes, but I think knowing these names is very essential because each of these people have played a very important role in sort of, as much as they're controversial, they're essential, right? So they've played a very important role for us in sustaining Indian dance. Rukmini Devi Arundel, the founder of Kalakshetra and one of the early Brahmin women to perform Bharatanatyam. To take up Bharatanatyam professionally and then take it up and systemize Bharatanatyam, and we'll see her contributions. Dr. E. Krishna here was he was also one of the founding members of the Madras Music Academy. He was a lawyer, he was an activist, he was a very important social figure. He also learnt dance himself, right? So he's a very important character in many ways. And he was the important force to sort of recognize the importance of dance, because even today you will see that in the Madras Music Academy, dance is only secondary to the music, right? So music has always had that prominence. So he was one of the founding fathers of Madras Music Academy, but also important people to give dance its required stature, right? And encouraging Brahmin practitioners to practice. But most importantly, in the 1930s, he was the most important person to bring Devadasi practitioners into dance, into the Madras Music Academy. Because in early 1930s, there was also a lot of uh, character assassination on the Devadasis. There were a lot of questions on their sanctity and dignity, and the whole practice of Sadir or Bharatanatyam. So, in that context, when Madras Music Academy started, you should understand it was started and uh, managed all by Brahmins, and all and only music was given predominance, because dance was also considered a fallen art, a degraded art. And in that context, E. Krishna Iyer brought dancing into Madras Music Academy, right? He brought, and that was one of his most important contributions. Dr. V. Raghavan, on the other hand, he's a Sanskrit scholar and one of the greatest Sanskrit scholars of our times. I don't know how many of you know a dancer scholar called Nandini Ramani. It is his father. It is her father. Nandini Ramani was one of the earliest students of Bala Saraswati. V. Raghavan translated, yeah, we'll get to the question. V. Raghavan translated a lot of Sanskrit documents. He took Sanskrit and made it important. He sort of Sanskritized Bharatanatyam, or also was able to make accessible Sanskrit documents for dancers, right? So this has been his contribution. So in the context of revival, three people most often spoken about people are Rukmini Devi Arundel, uh, E. Krishna Iyer, and Dr. V. Raghavan, right? But there are other characters that are not often spoken about that I want to mention. One is Bala Saraswati. Bala Saraswati is the hereditary practitioner of Bharatanatyam. She was from the hereditary families, and she practiced and she taught. She even taught in the Madras Music Academy, and she was one of the early hereditary practitioners to perform in music academy, but also to continue to perform in music academy, right? In 1930s, we see a lot of music academy performances by non-hereditary practitioners, but slowly from 1940s we stopped seeing hereditary practitioners, right? And in that context, it was only Bala Saraswati who could sustain as a hereditary practitioner. She could sustain the competition among other non-hereditary practitioners, right? And she spoke for her hereditary practice. So while Rukmini Devi, E. Krishna Iyer, V. Raghavan were sort of revivalists by making a statement, Balama's statement was her dance itself, right? Bala Saraswati did not know more, right? She was not as educated as the other three, right? So Bala Saraswati's practice itself was her activism, right? And hence it's not often spoken about. But you should think of it that in the context of revival, if a person like Bala Saraswati chose not to perform, the the idea that this is a hereditary practice itself would have been lost, and the idea that hereditary practices had its own sanctity and respect and respectability would have also been lost. So when we talk about revival, we should not ignore Balasaraswati. Another very interesting character, I think often not spoken about in the context of hereditary early revival, is Kamala, Kumari Kamala, who was an actor, right? Who was a child prodigy. She started acting in films around 5. They say she started learning dance around 3. I don't know whether it's possible for a 3-year-old now, as a mother of a 3-year-old, to, but yeah, she was a prodigy, right? But she had a huge impact. Why? Because Kamala took to both the stage and the screen, right? She has performed almost every year from 1947 in the Music Academy. And she also performed in cinema, and she did not really succeed as an actor, but she succeeded in cinema as a dancer. So you can see old cinema brochures saying these are the actors, but with special feature of Kamala's dancing. So Kamala was a very, very important figure, and again in the context of revival, because she sort of gave the Indian middle class this aspiration to dance, right? Which up until then was lost because of the because dance again was considered a fallen profession, a degraded profession. And in that context, when a Brahmin child like Kamala, right? So, and danced, and she took dance to every door, right? Like everybody, she was dancing in, of course, every door is a bit of an exaggeration because there was no OTT or YouTube, but she took it to the screen, and everybody, and cinema was such a popular medium. Kamala made dance an aspiration, right? And in fact, if you take most big Indian early dancers, early Brahmin dancers, you will see that, when you listen to their interviews or their stories, they'll often say, my mother watched Kamala's dance. So, and my mother was not allowed to dance, but she watched Kamala's dance and wanted me to dance. This is almost standard trope. And later it was Vaijayantimala for a lot of dancing girls, like dancing women. But early dancers, Kamala had this huge influence. And again, very often when we talk about early Brahmin practitioners of Bharatanatyam, we only talk about Rukmini Devi. But there were so many early practitioners of Bharatanatyam. In fact, Rukmini Devi was more busy in her activism, institutionalization of dance, setting up an institution. She was quite politically involved. She was also setting up, uh, of course, group shows for Bharatanatyam, which was again an unprecedented thing. But it was Kamala who actually set the tone for Brahmin girls to take up dancing, right? And Kamala was a young child, right? So for the mothers, for young girls, Kamala was more relatable or more inspiring than Rukmini Devi would have been, right? Now I'm just taking a pause to take these questions, and then a bit of divergence. E. Krishna was a dancer himself. Was this one of the first instances of male dancing? Okay, so this is actually, I think Ram Gopal, Uday Shankar would have been the first male dancing, and they are also very central figures to revival. I think even Matthew Allen's work doesn't cover Ram Gopal or Uday Shankar. But when in the context of revival, just talking about E. Krishna Iyer, Rukmini Devi, and V. Raghavan is very reductive and very narrow. So we should do a discussion on Ram Gopal and Uday Shankar, because also because you are sitting in the US, to really understand how dance became global, how Indian dance became global. These are very important figures. So I don't think Uday Shankar, E. Krishna Iyer was one of the first persons, but E. Krishna Iyer, actually, when he learned dance, he dressed as a woman. He didn't dance as a man. So if you look at E. Krishna Iyer's pictures, let me pull something out for you from the internet. Uh, he danced, and in fact, he dressed up quite similar to a Devadasi costume, right? I'm just pulling something up for you from the internet. Um
Akka, was this like acceptable back then, or was it kind of like shunned upon? The fact that they were taking up dance and all of this.
Just a second. So do you see
Uh-huh.
do you see just a second? Do you see E. Krishna Iyer's picture here? Like in the this is E. Krishna
Yeah.
Iyer. And he's dressed quite like a Devadasi, right? Because the costume is very Devadasi-ish, right? Okay. Your question. I'm just coming back to your question. Uh, how do I stop share? Okay, my sharing is. I'm not sharing my screen anymore. I still
You
am.
still are, yeah.
Oh my god. Okay, stop share.
I think if you go to like the top corner with the little icon,
Now it should
then
be fine. I stopped
yeah,
share.
it's gone. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
So E. Krishna Iyer's goal, I think, was not to be a dancer, but because he was doing this kind of an activism, his goal was to understand dance. So he, I think, learned this from a person. This is my understanding. I could be wrong here, but I think of him. He was never a performer of dance. All right. So he learned dance from this idea of trying to understand dance because he was propagating dance, right? So he would have wanted to feel what it is like. That is one thing. The other thing is he was also a bit into drama, and in a lot of people and again Tamil drama had a dance had gone into drama quite a bit, and drama became cinema, right? If you look, and so since he was also into drama, he probably learned dance to understand drama and to be a better at that. I These are my guesses. So what was your other question, Saishri?
I was just curious about the like climate in that time. Like, was it accepted? Because, as you mentioned originally, like the Isai Velar community, it was just the woman that practiced it,
Yeah.
right? So, as the re I hear you in that it's like the revival of it, but it's pretty bold back then, I think, right? Picking up a dance form that was not initially practiced by that gender. Was there like backlash they received? Was it accepted for them to practice dance
So
and
that's
pick it up?
something we'll take this question a little later because I think it'll
Sure, sure.
connect to something that I'm going to talk about. Don't keep your questions going because I don't mind this to be a completely interactive session, and I don't mind going back and forth as long as you don't mind. Right? So keep your questions coming, but this is a very interesting question, and just that I'd like to hold on to the thought and come back to it after we've spoken a little more. Why did the hereditary practitioners did not have enough support? And the other thing we need to understand is the entire movement that we're talking about today, the revival, happens in parallel with another movement, which is what is called the reform movement, right? So reform or anti-notch movement was to sort of ban the hereditary practitioners or remove the practice of temple hereditary dancing and abolishing temple dedication of dancers, right? So these two movements had similar yet different goals. While revival movement was to sustain the dance and to promote the dance, reform movement was to sort of again remove the dance from its temple practices and remove the dance from its practitioners, right? Why? Because temple dancing had reached its all-time low, and the practitioners themselves were uh, considered fallen. And we also spoke about Victorian morality. We spoke about how these women were not uh, because of their sexuality and their uh, uh, practices, their lifestyle, because the Devadasi was not just a caste, it was a lifestyle. It was a lifestyle choice that she did not marry, but she chose to have children, right? So, this lifestyle choice and all of this started getting associated and confused with a lot of all that these women are not proper women, right? These women are not from good families. We will see this. You will see repeatedly in the in revival and reform I really don't know why this happened. I hope the recording will be available. Yeah. Mhm. I logged out and logged in. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Anyway, so repeatedly you will see in the trope of revival this idea of these the good woman versus the bad woman, right? The good woman being the Brahmin woman and the bad woman being the Devdasi woman. Women from good families, women from bad families, right? Women from good families because they were married, they had, and then women from bad families because they were unmarried, right? And so these two were sort of parallel and opposing movements, whereas the good women were they tried to get the good women to dance, and they also tried to remove the bad women from dancing, and in the process sanitizing the dancing, right? So let me just go back to the idea of revival again, because I thought Shruti and Samyukta joined a bit late. So we saw revivification, that is bringing back to life, because the practice of temple dancing was being lost. The need to bring this back. Just give me a second. I'll change my room because I think there's an internet disturbance here. Yeah, sorry. So I was saying bringing back to life. So what did they bring back to life? The dance itself. And so I need all of you to also understand that these were their beliefs. It was not the beliefs of the revivalists. It was not like dance was gone, right? There were dancers all through this, right? It was never that dance was gone. It was never that there was only shringara, only vulgarity in dance, or it was not that all the dancing women uh, were sexually free, right? All of this is a generalization that the revivalists took too seriously and believed that they have to save, right? But did they really have to save something? Maybe not, right? Because the dance was always happening, and dance was always in had its life. And then repopulation. Now I need all of you to understand this term. Repopulation means uh, what we call they removed the population, which means the Isai Vellalars were totally slowly systematically removed, and then the Brahmins and other communities were brought in. Correct. Now this is the term that the West and other scholars often use as appropriation, and I really need you to know this term, because again the whole goal of history and this class is, when you are outside of this classroom, you should be aware of about dance history. And when there, because all of these conversations we're having today are very politically charged conversations, right? Because uh, is this not recorded? Just a second. Okay, it is recording. Okay. So these are very politically charged conversations, because there's caste involved, there's community involved, there's nationalism involved, right? So these, and again, to me, there are no rights and wrongs, but when you get out of this class and there is a debate, you should be aware of these terms and you should be aware of what is what, right? So the term appropriation. What is appropriation? Essentially taking away what is someone else's and making it yours. So what did we take away? We took away the dance from a community and made it ours. And in so much so that today classical music and dance is only associated with the Brahmins, right? And it's considered that only the Brahmins practice, whereas its origins are not in the Brahmin community. Correct. So this is, and this repopulation happens slowly and systematically. We see in the music academy also that, like I already told you, in the 1930s, E. Krishna Iyer brought in a lot of hereditary practitioners. The first ones to perform were called Kalyani daughters, Sabaranjitam and Jeevaratnam. They were the first ones to perform. And again, this was watched by Rukmini Devi Arundel, and she was like, oh wow, this is a beautiful form, I should learn it. So Rukmini Devi Arundel's inspiration was with Sabaranjitam and Jeevaratnam's dancing. Okay. And then the story goes on, and then she goes to Pandanallur Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai and says, I want to learn. She goes to Anna Pavlova, and she has a whole range of influences in her life. But this begins with Sabaranjitam and Jeevaratnam. Why do I talk so much about Music Academy? Music Academy as an organization is central to the revival because it was not the first Sabha, but it was the first important Sabha. Okay. And it was formed in 1927 after a meeting at the Indian National Congress. And you should put all of this revival, Music Academy, Rukmini Devi, Theosophy, all of this also in the context that India was fighting for its freedom, right? India was fighting for its new identity, right? Now, India is looking for uh, seeking out to its arts for its identity, right? Even look at all of you in the diaspora, right? The art gives you so much of, like, practicing Bharatanatyam gives you so much of a sense of community, so much of identity in the diaspora. Uh, Please tell me if I'm wrong here, but the arts, like, really puts gives you all that identity. I believe so. In the context of the revival, the arts, we sought out to the arts to give us that identity, right? So a music academy was a very important organization, right? And it was also at the helm of the music academy were very political figures and very big people, like very influential people like E. Krishna Iyer. So it was not like the other sabhas which was just started off by people who are interested in music, but these were people who are interested in music and dance with a purpose, right? So that really puts the music academy as one of the most historically important organizations. All right. And for me, other than this, and because we are today learning history and we are a bunch of interested people in dance history, for me, I feel the Music Academy is a brilliant resource because they have documented every conference of theirs from 1930s till today. All right. Everything has been documented and available for free on the internet. They've not just documented it, but also digitized it. Okay. So, and again, like with respect to early conversation, so Music Academy has a 10-day conference. All right. And then they have their kacheris. So for their concerts and kacheris, they've documented performance brochures, which is who performed what did Kamala perform, what did Rukmini Devi Arundel perform, what did Bala Saraswati perform. So what does that tell us? What did a hereditary practitioner perform? What did Rukmini Devi, who's a Brahmin practitioner, perform? What did Kamala, who shared this shared space of in cinema and the stage, perform? So this kind of performance brochures give us insights into what was the taste of the public and how did the taste of the public shape the dance, or how did the taste of these performers shape the dance, right? So these performance brochures are very important tools for analysis even today, right? So even today, if Nitya is performing, or Nitya's teacher Shweta and Priyadarshini Govind are performing, every performance of theirs is documented in the mid, and Music Academy is very religiously doing this. So it's an amazing space and an amazing resource. That is one thing. And the other thing is their conference. They run a 10-day conference, a musicology and dance conference, which has very I must say, scientific discussions on music and dance, right? And it's all again recorded. And once again, why is this very important? For me, it's very, very important because even this discussion that we are having is based on Matthew Allen's work, who's an American. So a lot of dance scholarship is written by Americans, is written by Westerners. So the lens with which their scholarship is done is very different, right? Whereas if you take an Indian talking about this dance, it may not sound scholarly or it may not sound erudite for many of us, but it's very important because they understand the Indian arts landscape. Right. So I think all of you, just as a hobby, start looking at in music academies brochures. All right. Okay, so the Madras Music Academy is also one of the central figures in the revival. And the Madras in the Madras Music Academy, we see this systematic removal and repopulation, right? And this process of repopulation is actually otherwise in scholarly and sociology called appropriation, because we took what was some other communities and we made it ours. But what did we, when we've taken some another communities, but we've also not just taken an art, but we've taken their livelihood, right? Because for the hereditary practitioners, this was their bread and butter. All right. um and in this context, now we will slowly attempt at answering Saishri's question. We saw that alongside repopulation, resituation, right? What is resituation? The hereditary practitioners performed in temples, they performed in courts, they performed in private spaces called salons, and now we see the practice of dance entering large stages for a public audience. For example, the Music Academy. Parallel to the Music Academy, another important and lesser spoken of space is the Tamilisai Sangam. Okay, so these were auditoriums that were hosting dance performances, right? So, with this resituation, we see a new feature. Rukmini Devi Arundel, in her first performance, she, because she consciously resituated the dance, she placed an idol of the Nataraja on the stage. How many of you have seen the Nataraja on the left hand side, on the right hand side corner of the stage? On the auditorium, most of us have, right? And I don't think today there is no Bharatanatyam performance without this right hand side corner Nataraja, right? But this was what we call an invented tradition. It was not traditionally there. In fact, an artist like Bala Saraswati, who's a hereditary practitioner, who was a hereditary practitioner of dance, said she doesn't want to do this placing of Nataraja. She says, what is this gimmick? You're going to lift your leg and dance in front of an icon. She thought it was disrespectful. Whereas Rukmini Devi Arundel thought it sanctified the space. She thought she was able to make the stage more temple like or give the stage a new sanctity, right? But why Nataraja over other gods? Probably the almost straightforward answer is, oh, Nataraja is the god of dance. That's the immediate answer. But you should again put this in context, right? The Nataraja was the central figure to the revival of Bharatanatyam. Okay. Nataraja is a very specific South Indian composition of Shiva, right? Shiva itself, like Vishnu has many avatars, Shiva has many forms, many iconographic forms. We know of the Linga. We know of Ardhanarishwara. We know of Shiva doing different forms of Tandava. We know of Shiva in the form of Bhikshatanamurti, the one who's the beggar. We know of Shiva who's also, uh, I mean, so many forms of Shiva. Dakshinamurti, the more peaceful form of Shiva. Shiva also has many iconographic forms. Nataraja is a very specific form limited to the kshetra or the temple of Chidambaram, right? and it is a specific Chola iconographic form. And only the lifted leg form of Shiva is called the Nataraja. Shiva, other dancing forms of Shiva is also not called the Nataraja. Okay, I need you all to understand this very well, because this very, and one, now today you are sitting in the US. Everywhere, if you talk about Shiva, if you talk about dance, if you talk about Indian art, Nataraja became a global icon of Indian art. Every museum across the world, be it the British Museum, be it the museums in New York, they all carry a figure, a bronze of Chola bronze of Nataraja, right? Nataraja became a symbol of Indian art itself during the revival period. Again, that was not a conscious thing, that was not an effort by the revival Bharatanatyam revivalists, but it was a coincidence, because the Indian art and iconography was going through a certain revival, and that coincided with the Bharatanatyam's revival, right? And at that point, dance revivalists like Rukmini Devi were like, hey, oh my God, we are ignoring this entire icon based on which our dance is based. And then Rukmini Devi brought Nataraja to the stage. So it was a very calculated move. All right. Why did Nataraja became very so global? That's another story, but it's again important for you to know this name. Anand Kumaraswamy. Anand Kentish Kumaraswamy was a museum curator. He was an art historian, and he also understood Tamil poetry, and he wrote. He was most famous for this essay called Dance of Shiva. Okay. And as dancers, we should all know his name also, because he translated the Abhinay Darpana. Okay. Abhinay Darpana is from where we've taken all our hastas, Pataka, Tripataka, Ardha Pataka. Okay. Is this going over your head, or because these are many loose threads, we are learning to connect this. Okay.
I have a quick question on the
Yeah.
sequence of this. So well, kind of to take one step back. So we spoke about iconography, right? Like why Nataraja exists and things like that. So did the hereditary practitioners, when they practice dance, did they actually like, the hastas when we show like the Shivalingam and things like that, did they use those or did those happen after the revivalist movement?
Interesting. No, I would say the hereditary practitioners used very similar Bharatanatyam language, but it was
Okay.
modified. In fact, we've removed a lot of hastas. Hereditary practitioners had a lot of unique vocabulary also. They, like, for example, every kind of bird would have had a vocabulary. For us, bird probably is today's generic, right? So we've lost Rati hastas, like a lot of love. Because the hereditary practice was very based on Shringara. They had very specific hastas to depict very specific things. Also, but we've only borrowed from them. All right.
Okay.
But the practice of like worshipping Nataraja, for example, was not there in the hereditary practice. One. The other thing is, hereditary practice was based on context. Which king are you dancing for? Which god are you dancing for? If I am dancing in Tanjavur, I danced for Brihadishwara. Brihadishwara is not Nataraja. A hereditary practitioner in Chidambaram would dance for Nataraja on Nataraja, but a hereditary practitioner in in Tanjavur would not have the context of Chidambaram. Okay, a hereditary practitioner in Tiruvidai Marudur would not have the context of Tanjavur or Chidambaram. Since hereditary practice was so local, right? So today, if you and me dance a Varnam, we use all hastas we have for Shiva. We do a mishmash, right? It is not wrong. The context in which you and me are performing are different. That's it, right? But like for example, the most famous Varnam on Shiva, Mohamanayan Meedil, is a very specific depiction of Tiruvarur Tyagaraja, right? So Tiruvarur Tyagaraja is what is called a Somaskanda Murti. It is not Nataraja. But today the context of Shiva itself has become Nataraja. Shiva and Nataraja have become synonymous. Today's audience, if you don't show a Nataraja for Shiva, they will not even understand. Who will understand a Somaskanda like this? It's not easy. So you have to do this traditional Nataraja pose for your audience to understand, right? But in the context of revival, the idea of Nataraja became very popular because of two reasons. One is the essay called Dance of Shiva by Ananda Kumaraswamy, who who first of all found a lot of beauty in this Nataraja icon, one. And he sort of not just took the idea of its beauty to the world, but he also gave it a lot of spiritual metaphysical meaning, right? He explained the iconography and the composition of the iconography so beautifully. That is what we today call panchakritya. That is the Abhayahasta, the salvation, the cycle of life, destruction, creation, removal of ignorance. In fact, there are a lot of questions and controversies whether the original sculptor, who sort of came about, actually had so much thought when he sculpted, or all of this is Ananda Kumaraswamy's imagination. So it is the iconography of Nataraja and the iconography understanding of Nataraja we have today is an interpretation. Whether it's the original intention is a serious question, right? It is so in that context, Nataraja became like this global fascination, right? The art of Nataraja. And then dance, revivalists are like, but hey, this icon is meant for dance, and they brought it to the stage. Then the other thing that I wanted to connect this to is male dancing. So in 1940s, not just do we see non-hereditary practitioners of dance, but we see slowly male dancers coming. And for the male dancers, Nataraja also brought this validation, right? So the revival is a very complex situation. It's Indian nationalism, it's Indian freedom, right? It is it's the reform is happening where you're removing hereditary practices, you're bringing in male dancers, and in all of and you've resituated the dance form. And when you've resituated the dance form, you're trying to sanctify the stage as a temple, and for that validation you're using the iconography of Nataraja. Okay. And then there are male dancers also coming, and then you're like, and then there is, of course, a lot of question whether men can dance or not at all. And then you're seeking validation from this icon. Very interestingly, Ram Gopal, who's again not often spoken about in the context of revival, and we must speak about him, his costume, he made an entire headgear which was inspired by the Tiruvalangadu Nataraja icon. His costume was inspired by Nataraja. Okay, so so that you can see that the Nataraja was also a very important revival figure, right? Yeah, Saishri, you wanted to say something now? Mhm.
One question. So I remember, I can't quote the article, but I was reading this interesting article about, the Hindu nationalism that occurred right after independence as a way to protect themselves again from being broken apart. And it was really interesting because Hinduism didn't really exist before. It was like a term
Yes.
coined to unify many different communities that practice different things. And as a part of that, I remember reading that most communities had their own indigenous gods and goddesses. So my question is, was Brihadishvara also considered more of a, not like a village god, but like a more regional god, goddess? Even today, when you go to parts of India, like even my great grandmother and grandmother is named after like the local village deity. Is that what Brihadishvara was before it became kind of unified all under Shiva and Nataraja?
Probably. I see, but I think of it as because at least with respect to Tanjavur, there was a by then the bhakti movement was full swing, and there were many local deities. Even around Tanjavur, there are many Mariammans, many local Tamil gods. But I would think of Brihadishwara because uh, even 1,000 years ago, Brihadishwara was more Sanskritic. It was a slightly more global figure. Is how I mean, slightly more popular, not regional, but it is a very regional figure because Tanjavur is a small. state and small region. And I I don't have a straightforward answer. It is very regional, yes, it is very regional, but I think it was regional but popular. It was not regional in the sense that, uh, in India, every tree is worshipped. There,
Yeah.
every local god, local gods were trees. There were local gods were, even today, if you go to local villages, a lot of local gods were warriors. They have a sword, they're sitting on a horse. If they will be called Pandian, Marudu, things, these are, they were not gods unified by the Agama Shastras. If I were to say, but Brihadishwara is in fact one of those whose rituals are very Sanskritic. So in that sense, he's not a local village. It's not a cult god. It's not a local village god. It's a very, you get what I say. And Brihadishwara also was a symbol of success. The building of the Tanjavur temple and big temple projects were undertaken by the Cholas to signify success. And they made the Tanjavur the capital. So Brihadishwara was probably the most important deity for the people in that capital region, extended capital region itself. So in that sense, I don't think he's local.
It was not meant to be like a hub for dancers. I think when Rajaraj Chola, when he first envisioned it, it came to him in a dream, right, during his Sri Lanka campaign, and he meant for it to actually be an architectural marvel. So the reason it's a UNESCO heritage is because of that Vimana, which was supposed to be like Mount Meru and everything. And then I think, as the story goes, if I remember when I visited as part of architecture school, um, it became a hub for dancers as a secondary layer to make it seem more grand and make it seem more communal.
But here
But
is the
he
thing.
initially just wanted it to devote it to Shiva, right? And then he
Absolutely.
included the arts into it.
See, but the whole idea is every temple and temple building and arts were always interconnected. If he
Yeah,
built a temple, he would have had, because I mean, the whole myth around bringing 400 dancers, it's not just dancers. He brought in musicians, he brought in
yeah.
so much into it. Like he infused so much art itself into it. So temples and art was like yeah, it's so interconnected that there was no temple building. Temples were not built for arts, but it was
Yeah.
in the Maratha period, probably it became a center for arts. But you cannot imagine a temple without the art. It's something like that, right? So anyway, so Nataraja also in sort of became this very important revivalist. In so if you now think about revival, you should talk Rukmini Devi Arundel, you should talk Bala Saraswati, you should talk Kamala, you should talk E Krishna Iyer, you should talk about V Raghavan, you should talk about Ram Gopal Uday Shankar, you should talk about Nataraja, you should talk about Ananda Kumaraswamy. Each of these people uh, played an important role in different spaces. Is that like, do you now understand the larger context of revival? And I also hope those whose videos are switched off are following, because this understanding revival becomes a very important conversation. Thank you, Vidyuta. Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Shruti Kirti. I understand you're not able to keep your video on, but I hope you're able to sort of follow the conversation. The other important thing about repopulation is and appropriation is there are two steps to this appropriation. One is removing hereditary dancers, right? And when hereditary dancers lost their jobs, they migrated to the cities, right? And when the hereditary profession of dancing was lost, also the Nattuvanars, also the musicians, when there was no dancing in temple, what will the musicians do? They also migrated to the cities. Am I right? Now, when they migrated to the cities, the Nattuvanars also needed jobs. So the Nattuvanars initially found jobs in Kalakshetra. They found jobs in Chennai as dance gurus. They found jobs in cinema as choreographers. They found job in cinema as musicians. right? Early cinema was extensively choreographed by Valuvur Ramaya Pillai, right? Early and Kalakshetra, the early dance gurus of Kalakshetra were Pandanallur Chokkalingam Pillai, early dance gurus of then later K. and Dandayadapani Pillai, all of whom were hereditary practitioners, right? Soon that was also sort of removed. I just want to 1 minute. Quote Rukmini Devi Arundel here. I just want to read a quote. So, when you think about appropriation and the removal of hereditary practice, it happened in two steps. One is removing the dancers, and then subsequently, but we were still dependent on the musicians. You could not do dance without these musicians. So, but once, and then later, I think after we got enough from these musicians, there was removal of the musicians as well. So, the appropriation can be thought of as two steps, right? Removal of the dancers and the removal of the Nattuvanars. Now, here I just like to quote Rukmini Devi Arundel. Uh, yeah, she says this in 1943. One great new thing has come as a result of these difficulties is the complete separation of our work from the traditional dance teachers. It is a well-known fact that only a small clan of people who never believed it was possible for anybody else to conduct a dance performance. That is, she says, the Nattuvanars believed nobody else could conduct a dance performance. uh, it is a well-known fact that there are a small clan of people who have never believed it is possible for anybody else to conduct a dance performance. I have always had a determination that this must go. They used to think that except the usual class of people, nobody else could dance. Now, there are so many girls from good families who are excellent dancers. The second aspect is to train Nattuvanas, dance teachers from good families. Now, I am happy that on Vijayadashami day, I could prove that we could do without them. So, one fine Vijayadashami around 1940s, Rukmini Devi Arundel decided Kalakshetra will not have hereditary practitioners. Okay, and that Nattuvangam can also be done by non-hereditary practitioners. Right? Even during early revival, when it either it's Rukmini Devi or Kamala, all of the Nattuvangam and the music was done by, even though the dancers were non-hereditary, the music was done by hereditary practitioners. So the second level happened in the 1940s, where there was this careful elimination or deliberate elimination of the hereditary practitioners. This was also because of a series of issues that cropped up between Rukmini Devi and Pandanallur Chokkalingam Pillai. Later, because hereditary practitioners also, again, politically incorrect to say this, but they were also very greedy. There are a lot of instances where hereditary practitioners demanded obnoxious amounts of money, which was not feasible, right? And there was a lot of monopoly, right? And then Rukmini Devi said, no, hey, you know what, we can do this ourselves. But again, slowly, the community was removed from the profession, right? You did see that later they were able to establish private dance schools like S.K. Rajaratnam Pillai, who's Priyadarshini Govind's guru, Valuvur Ramaya Pillai. They all had private dance schools, but eventually that also faded off because the dancers who trained under them became Nattuvanars. They became dance teachers themselves. All right. So this is the second level of appropriation and revival that we'll have to keep in mind. The next thing is the reconstruction process. Again, you will see in a series of conversations in the Madras Music Academy and other places about reconstruction of Bharatanatyam. So, what is reconstruction? One is you had to reconstruct it to suit to the stage. Not just by placing Nataraja, but also by changing the repertoire, by also making the repertoire relevant to the times in which they were performing, right? Shringara as a concept is a very, again, because the Devadasis performed and they were married to the god, probably Shringara was relevant. Now, when a 10-year-old Kamala was dancing on stage, Shringara was probably not relevant to her and her audience. So there was a need to sort of one sanitize the dance, but also make it palatable to the modern audience. So with, especially with Kamala, you start seeing the snake dance becoming popular, the Kurati dance becoming popular, and a lot of newer compositions and a lot of bhakti driven compositions. And soon enough, a lot of compositions that were borrowed from the Carnatic music repertoire. Right? Earlier, dance and music had its own distinct repertoire, and then we start seeing an exchange in repertoire. Right? One example in this context is the composition Natana Madinar. Okay, this is a recent session that I did, so I'm just taking that example. Natana Madinar was a composition. How many of you have learned this composition? You have? Okay. Have you learned Bo Shambho? No. So Natana Madinar, Bo Shambho. Bo Shambho happens much later, of course. But Kale Tuki, Adi Kondar, these were a new brand of compositions in the that popularized the icon of Shiva, Nataraja, in the 30s and 40s. Again, an analysis of the Music Academy brochures in the 30s and 40s tells us that Natana Madinar was a mainstay in performances. Right? It was like, oh, it's like I danced Alaripu Jatiswaram Varnam. You know, you don't explain which Alaripu, which Jatiswaram, which Varnam. So, Alaripu Jatiswaram Varnam, Tillana, Natana Madinar. Natana Madinar often happened after the Tillana. Right? And and Natana Madinar also happened extensively in the movies. 4 5 films portrayed Natana Madinar. Why? Because this composition was so popular and so universal. Right? Also, cinema always, whether it is today or back in the day, wanted these hook songs, right? Like you always wanted one number, which is so. And Shiva Nataraja was so popular. The deity of Shiva was getting popular, and the composition of Natana Madinar. And Natana Madinar was also a very probably danceable song, right? You showed different poses. You could show a lot of gymnastic abilities of dancers, and it was also very amenable for a kid to portray her skill. So again, this composition became very, very, very popular in that context, and so a new brand of compositions came. Up until then, the second half compositions, even today, your second half compositions were ideally Shringara pieces, Padams, Javalis. But then, in the under the watchful eye of Rukmini Devi Arundel, Kalakshetra started doing Kirtanams, which is they borrowed compositions from um, Carnatic music repertoire, right? And even take Natana Madinar, for example, it is a very different talam, it is an atatalam, right? You did not up until then see very complicated, not that hereditary practitioner Nattuvanars were not adept in talams, but you will not see Atatalam belong to a Sula the Saptatala system, which is a Carnatic music system. In dance, we did Rupaka Talam, we did the Chapu Talams, we did Adi Talam. Okay, but Atatalam was never there in our context. So things like this were actually taken from Carnatic music repertoire. And in this context, you should also remember that second half compositions for Shiva there were never many second half compositions on Shiva. It was either Krishna or Murugan on whom Padams and Javalis were written. Okay, and except one or two like Thiruvilvarano, most of it was Murugan and Shiva, Murugan and Krishna. In that context, you should now see that Nataraja and Shiva in the second half was evolving its own repertoire. Kale Tuki, Natamadi Tirinda, so many compositions, right? And such compositions became popular in this era. So this reconstruction of a repertoire was also a very deliberate act. All right. I'll just go through the other factors. Resituation we have done. Renaming. Again, you will see that after a series of deliberations in the Madras Music Academy in the 30s, you will see that Bharatanatyam was a chosen name. Another misconception is that Bharatanatyam was a name that was coined. Bharatanatyam was not coined, it was chosen. But before the name Bharatanatyam was chosen, South Indian dance was loosely known by several names. Chinnamelam, Periyamelam, sorry, Chinnamelam, not Periyamelam, Chinnamelam, Dasiyatam, Sadir, Kelika, Chaduru, Bhogam. These were several different names with which dance was known. But Bharatanatyam was also one of the names. The renaming was again an important process because by renaming, you gave dance a new sanctity, right? And by choosing Bharatanatyam, you gave it that connection with Bharata or the sage Bharata, and you gave it Bharatanatyam that connection with the Natya Shastra. And this connection was also a forged connection for the revival, right? Not to say that dance and Natya Shastra was not connected, but dance and Natya Shastra were sort of forcefully connected for the validation. Okay. So this was and it's also very, very interesting for us to know that early 1930s and 40s during revival period, the term Bharatanatyam included Sadir, that is the solo form, Kuravanji Natakam, and Bhagavatamela. I do not know when Bharatanatyam eventually came to be known only for what we are practicing today. But in the early idea of Bharatanatyam included Bhagavatamela as well, included Kuravanji dance dramas as well. Slowly, I think these two were removed and only Bharatanatyam as a group, because today it's inevitable to, because we get only 15 minutes, we're all too many dancers, we have to do group performances to attract audiences. But the form of Bharatanatyam we do is what is group and solo is what is Bharatanatyam. But earlier it was Sadir, Kuravanji and Bhagavatamela, and Bharatanatyam was an umbrella term to cover these forms, right? And the renaming, and you will again see in the early 1930 conversations that there is a lot of debates, and Bharatanatyam was a chosen name. So, and that is how we came up with Bharatanatyam. And another important thing, again, you probably should think about is we did not choose Bharatanatyam because it included Bhava Raga Tala. Every dance form includes Bhava Raga Tala. Music also includes Bhava Raga Tala, right? This was just an interesting acronym that we added to it after we chose Bharatanatyam. The term Bharatanatyam did not come from Bhava Raga Tala. No. The term Bharatanatyam also existed and it was chosen. All right. So next time when we read our Arangetram scripts, we should think about these things and probably take these things more responsibly. All right. So I think that's about the revival. I'm now open to taking questions and discussions. Saishri, so your question on male dancing, has it been sort of
Yeah, completely.
okay?
Makes a lot of sense. There was actually one more question I had. And
Okay.
this is just something I've been thinking about for a while, but you spoke about it briefly. So in the revivalists, we spoke about, Rukmini Devi Arundel, who, was almost a reinterpretation of the art form, right? A reconstruction of it. But then there's also Bala Saraswati, who came from the group of individuals that practiced this dance. So I was just curious. I've looked at some videos here and there. Um, was the aesthetics and technique very different between both? When they did the dance itself, because I feel like when you look at Bharatnatyam, 30, 40 years ago, it looks very, very different from the way it's practiced today from a technique and form standpoint. It has morphed. So I was just wondering, when they both existed at the same time, did their dances differ
Yes.
or
Rukmini
contrast?
Devi's dance differed from Bala's dance. Bala's dance differed from Kamala's dance. Kamala's dance differed. So dance. So this is again something we've probably lost in the last 30, 40 years is diversity in dance styles. Today, as much as you and me claim that, oh, we are learning a particular style, or we are not Kalakshetra, or we are learning Pandanallur or whatever, today, more or less, all of Bharatanatyam looks similar, right?
Yeah.
And this is again, I mean, it was not an immediate consequence of revival, but it was sort of an unintended long-term consequence. While the revival happened in the 30s, I think post 90s and 2000s especially, there are more uniform standards of dancing. And earlier, I think people also had the ability to appreciate diversity. Today, we are not able to appreciate diversity. We quickly brand dance as good dancing and bad dancing.
I think that also speaks to the way it's taught, right? Standardization. There's like pros and cons. Standardization allowed it to branch out and survive in many
Yes,
ways, but also
yes,
it stifles creativity, right?
yes,
Because we are taught to learn the technique in a very specific way for years.
yes.
And then upon mastering that, then you're taught like concepts like intention and making very conscious choices of why you move the way you do, which I think is just interesting in the way you
Yeah,
see
it
this art
is
form.
very interesting. Again, really, I think in all of this, the word I keep repeating is context. The context in which you and me are dancing, it is very different from the context even in which 30 years ago people danced. Today, there is Instagram. Today, there is TikTok. Uh, Today, the lights play a very important role on the stage. So, the aesthetic of dance is co-evolving with all these things. When Rukmini Devi, I mean, even the intention in which Kalakshetra evolved, or Rukmini Devi's idea of Kalakshetra Bani and today's Kalakshetra Bani, according to me itself, is very different, right? Uh, so there are so many forces, and so today I think um, it's very hard for us to go back. We have to follow our teachers to some extent, right? And also to survive as a dancer professionally today, you cannot say that I will not sit in Aramandi because the hereditary practitioners' idea of Aramandi was different, right? Because today we are b- uh, go ahead, don't sit in Aramandi, but you will lose out. That's it. It's as simple as that. If you are willing to, sort of fight it out, sure, go ahead. But if you're not, you have to play to the masses. You have to play to what is the industry, the standard set by the industry today. But the aesthetic of Bala Saraswati and aesthetic of Rukmini Devi, aesthetic of Kamala, aesthetic of so many people who coexisted was different. And even 30 years ago, there was a diversity in styles, right? Again, I think also today the understanding of the body, for example, is so much more, right? Because today we understand the core, we understand the muscles, we are able to also dance very intentionally, right? Which probably they did not. So there are so many forces that are governing dance today. I'm going to first take Chinmayi's question before I take okay tangent. In today I attended a Varnam salon in which one of the acts was this contemporary group that did a reimagining based on Odissi that in no way looked in relation. I got mildly triggered. The reason is the choreographer gave was that he interpreted that was true to him as a queer person in the diaspora, and then what he learned was restrictive. Okay, and as a Bharatanatyam student who wants to preserve and hold on, my answer is it was completely Western looking and did not sit with me at all. I wonder, yeah, that's exactly how Rukmini people felt about Rukmini Devi's dance or Brahmin dance. Yes. Yes, the Rukmini Devi triggered so many people. So I agree with you, Chinmayi, and I would be triggered as well. And this goes back to today's debate on Ananya Pandey's dance for the screen, right? I am triggered as well, but it is not in your control or my control. And will dance today does not belong to one practitioner, one body, one form. And today it is even no more Bharatanatyam, it is Indian dance. That is it, right? What is Bharatanatyam? And today, to even claim a certain lineage or claim a certain Bani is ridiculous because none of us know. Even Kalakshetra, at least 30 years ago, I think Kalakshetra Bani held to its roots. But today, even Kalakshetra Bani is out of its roots.
Yeah, I think part of the reason I was so conflicted by being triggered today is, conflicts within my identity of having like lived half my life in India and half my life in America. But I have been a student of the Kalakshetra Bani my entire life. And just 3 years, 2, 3 years ago, when I joined Nityaka, is when I actually, started this Vajur style, learning about the differences between the Banis and sort of relearning a lot of things. And so I can, like today, I kind of can understand after this performance, like how people would have been triggered by Rukmini
Yeah.
Devi, Arundel, and why there is that inflection in people's voices sometimes when they mention Kalakshetra. But I find that very conflicting because to me, I'm like, I think it's a personal bias having like lived and loved the Kalakshetra Bani my entire life and kind of understanding in a way that maybe she did her best because it was the sanitizing Bharatanatyam was the only way it could survive. But like that personal love for instilled love for Kalakshetra, and then today being completely triggered by this. It
See, but
looked
also
contemporary. It
one
was
thing.
contemporary set to an Odyssey song, really. And so it's just today's been very conflicting in terms of emotions
I
for
agree.
me.
I would be also, I would be also, as much as it's easy for me to say, I completely disapprove of all of this because of growing up with a certain aesthetic, growing up in India and continuing to live in India, and also my love for history, right? So I'm so much like I'm watching Kamala all the time. I'm watching Evie Saroja. I'm watching all these old traditional styles. I can't handle this. I agree, but this is probably how, because I love Kamala, because I say that she's the, for to me, she's the most, she's the gold standard of tradition for me. But fun fact, Kamala, when she came to cinema and she came to Varura, she had 3 years of training in Kathak. So her early cinema has a lot of influence of Kathak steps. Not her early cinema, her early Bharatanatyam. So you should think that Varvur Ramaya Pillai allowed her, because her body was so fluid with all of these Kathak movements, allowed her to go ahead and continue doing Kathak in her Bharatanatyam. And that would have also, so I think, eventually when the dance was removed from its hereditary context, it became it, and it will continue to be everybody's aesthetic vision, right? Today, the Varvur Bani you are learning is somebody's aesthetic of the Varvur Bani. It is not the Varvur Bani. It is a certain aesthetic and a certain artistic vision of one person's Varvur Bani. Right? I have also been trained in a Varvur Bani, which is a very different Varvur Bani from yours. And that is somebody else's aesthetic of the Varvur Bani. And so now, what is pure? What is the right Varvur? It is, we can go on. But I know this conflict. I know it's unsettling. And we'll have to learn to live with this and learn to accept this. But I also think in this thing, what we should probably try to appreciate is that this diversity should coexist, because otherwise you will become irrelevant. If everybody is dancing what you are dancing, you will not be special.
Hmm.
And I think that is also why there is a certain disinterest today in Bharatanatyam, because back in the day when all of these dancers danced, they danced, in fact, their repertoire was boringly similar. Natana Madinar is there in everybody's program brochure, but everybody danced it so differently because every dancing body was different. And today we are sort of standardizing the dancing body. So that is something, if anything, think about that as a take home. I think we should all probably understand that the dance will to for the dance to exist and the dance to thrive, we should promote diversity. Yeah. Any other it's a very nice question. Hmm. But the concretized idea of good and bad dancing is based on the current idea of good aesthetic, I feel, is it is limiting to the dance itself. Wish there was more room in today's social media age. Almost everything is homogenized, and there is no. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. But I don't know if we have an alternate also, or I also think we're too steep into this. It's so hard for us to go back. uh, or so I think. Uh, yeah.
I think it's also important to question like intent, right? So you see a piece and it's very different, right? So it causes a lot of feelings. And it's actually something I spoke to Nitya like a couple of years ago as a topic, and she made a really interesting point of like, well, why did they choose to do what they did? Was there intention and thought behind it, or was it just because? So let's say you have actually like been steeped in the art form for a couple of years, explored it a lot, then like experimentation kind of makes sense. But if you just learn Bharatnatyam and like on day three, you're like, no, I want to do it this way, you have to like kind of sometimes take a moment and think and question intent. Um, and I think that's helped me build patience before, well, like, I guess, analyzing and forming an opinion on
Yeah,
what I see and watch. Because context, as you mentioned, Akka, is like important, right? In everything. Like,
yeah,
for example, even in taste, right? Like when we discuss a performance, the whole class watches. It's sometimes really shocking how like one person has a completely different takeaway and what they like and preferences from another. Um, and I find a lot of that also has to do with upbringing, and biases are also taught, right? Biases are also taught when you are learning. So it's just, I think it's preferences, contextual, all of that. There's
yeah.
no right or wrong
There is no
in
there
every,
is no right or
everything.
wrong.
Yeah.
But I totally get what Chinmay says when she says she's triggered. I would be as well, but I will say only the politically right thing, or like in another space I would be like, oh yeah, it's their aesthetic.
I think that's exactly that was my thing too, is that I was talking about it with some of my friends. We went together and I was like, and I'm also like, I've studied like urban design where all we talk about is context. I was like, in any other show, I would have loved it. I would be like, okay, there were some tate tetas and it matched the music. But I was like, in this context, it feels like irreverent and like almost tone deaf, maybe. And then I looked up what a Pallavi is in Odyssey, and it didn't seem like the most translate. It seemed more like a Tilana than a Varnam to me. And I don't know
So
Odyssey. This is like a
the other
5 minute
thing
Google search.
I
And so
see.
I was like, it didn't sit in that Varnam salon. It's
So
that was my
I
only thing.
totally agree. And the other really questionable thing for me in today's era is, are we, there is a need to create. There is a need to create, and it's like a very forceful need to create. All right. With respect to, see, I still dance, and I dance. And with respect to my own dancing, I don't think of myself as a great dancer, but I love dancing, right? And I still perform, but and at least in the spaces in which I perform, and I don't find the need to create, because I have so many good pieces I've inherited from my teachers, right? And I don't think I can add any value to this, and I'm not or I don't feel trained enough to create yet, right? And again, creating a new piece, and we also, the other thing we need to understand is, of course, I choreograph small pieces for my students, right? But that does not, in my opinion, require new thought or skill. Over the years of experience, setting a new kautavam on a student based on their abilities, that is not a creation for me, right? But today, this need to sort of stand out has become very important. And that is something, again, I think as students of dance, you should all think about. If I am doing a margam, or if I am doing a solo, uh, why do I want to create? Because everybody is creating. If that is your answer, think through it, right? Because we all have great pieces, and we have enough to, I mean, for an audience, whether the piece is yours or your guru's, honestly doesn't make a difference to them, right? So this need to, it really stems from the need to create, and I don't agree with that. And the other thing, actually, this, I don't know where I saw Shweta Prachande's some Ask Me Anything, and that really hit me very hard. Somebody asked her about some fusion, and she was like, really do it if you believe in it. Like if this, but don't do it. I think she said something on these lines, and it really hit me hard. And I also think when you create something like that, you should be grounded in both. You should have enough skill and knowledge in both the forms. Without having enough skill and knowledge in both the forms, taking that is problematic. If you have enough skill, knowledge, and you know why you are taking this from this form and this part of this form, ODC from this, I think totally go ahead. But without that, I think it is really problematic for me. So uh, in that sense, I think it is good to believe that you have to learn, standardization of technique, learn one technique properly, uh, get rooted in that, and then sort of learn another, give it that respect. Even if you take Bharatanatyam and hip hop, it is very important for you to know what hip hop is, where it came from, before, respect hip hop as much as Bharatanatyam if you're mixing the two. That is something. That is something. And the other, for me, I also find it very disturbing to use a Bharatanatyam costume to do something else. See, again, Rukmini Devi's costume or the Bharatanatyam costume you and me are wearing is also invented. I think that's an entire discussion we should have at some point. It is an invented tradition. But again, that invention came from a place of respect. That invention came again from context. She wanted to put an Indian art at a certain, give it a certain stature. And that invention, I mean, of course, Bharatanatyam costumes have gone through so much transformation, right? And these inventions have come from convenience, come from context, come from respect, and all of these three reasons, even if it is convenience, it's a very valid reason, right? If you want your dance costume to be more, that's also a valid reason. But to just take that and do something else, uh, yeah, I also find that a bit disrespectful. Again, I think we are in a very different world today, and to say something like this is becomes politically incorrect. So I would stay safe. I will just say that this doesn't match my taste and aesthetic. But for me, deep down my heart, it feels disrespectful. Purely also being, will you play cricket in a Bharatanatyam costume? No, you go to a cricket field in your jersey. You go to a swimming a pool in a. So then each space has a certain respect, a certain costume, a certain attire. I think you should give that respect. And when you see a hip hop Bharatanatyam fusion wearing this kind of a costume, it is not only aesthetically disturbing, at some level disrespectful also. But again, we are in a very different world, so we should play safe. Yeah. Any other questions? Uh, yeah, sure, Saishri. We should probably do a discussion and look at the evolution of costumes as well. Yeah. Okay. If nothing, we'll uh, talk to you soon. I'll meet you all soon sometime. Yeah. See you. Bye.